Today on The Nation Speaks, police shootings, trials, protests, Antifa. Where's it all heading? Not down a very good road, according to our guests. A new commission will study Supreme Court reform. Is President Biden just appeasing the left wing of his party, or does the commission have real teeth? And after 20 years in Afghanistan, American troops are coming home. And there are wildly different opinions on whether that's a good idea or not. In America Q&A, we ask if governors should have unlimited powers to deal with the pandemic, and how much do we value our elderly? Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. The nation was already on edge. In Minnesota, former police officer Derek Chauvin is on trial for murder over the in-custody death of George Floyd. Reopening wounds from Black Lives Matter and Antifa-led protests and riots that peaked last summer across the country. Then last week, barely 10 miles north of the courtroom, now ex-officer Kim Potter accidentally shot her gun instead of her taser at another black man during a traffic stop, killing 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Demonstrators poured into the streets. Not only in Minneapolis, but Portland, Sacramento, and other cities have seen nights of arson, looting, and violent clashes with police. To help us gain some perspective on what's happening, why, and what might lie ahead, we have two guests with us who have unique insights into these questions. Joining us now is Sergeant Betsy Smith, spokesperson for the National Police Association. Welcome, Sergeant Smith.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the big question that's, on most people's minds. How could a veteran of the police force make such a tragic mistake?
And that's exactly what it is. It is a horrible, tragic mistake, one that Officer Potter is going to pay for the rest of her life, both civilly, criminally, emotionally. But this happens in a profession where we're involving motor programming along with things like stress, training. I mean, commercial pilots and military pilots crash planes. Mistakes happen in various professions, and that's what happened here.
Is it true that the gun and the taser are on different sides of the body?
Yes, and I actually carried a taser for many years as a law enforcement officer. And I'm a right-handed shooter, so my gun was on my right side, on my hip. My taser was on the left side of my hip toward the front in what we call a cross draw situation. Now, you still have to draw that taser with your strong hand, what we would call our pistol hand. And we train to go back and forth between various tools. Because remember, we don't just have a pistol and a taser. We might have a baton. We might have pepper spray. We have to, deal with our handcuffs. So, but the taser training that American law enforcement does tends to be maybe once a year. And I think we'll probably see that change.
So you've said this has happened before. I know there have been cases in the past. What happened to the officers in those situations?
Most famously in the Oscar Grant case, the BART police officer in California who accidentally shot Oscar Grant and killed him, that officer went to prison. There have been about 16 of these cases in the last 10 years or so. And so where criminal charges were appropriate, criminal charges were applied. And that's what we're seeing here with Officer Potter. Did she have the intent to kill Daunte Wright? Clearly not. You can tell on the video. She thought she was deploying her taser. She even says, "I'm going to tase you, taser, taser." These things happen. The system is such that she will be punished.
The case is just so heartbreaking from both sides. You can really feel for both sides. I saw an interview with his mother, and she was saying, that she can't accept that this was an accident. As an officer, what can you say to that?
Well, I'm a mother. I have 4 kids. I can't even begin to imagine the pain that his mother and his family are in. But there is no racial animus in this case. That is very clear. And yet this has been turned into a racial issue and an anti-police issue. I understand his mother saying, I just can't accept that this is an accident. But I want to point out, and this is something that we need to really talk about in this country, is that we need to go back and teach young drivers and young people that they need to cooperate with law enforcement. If Mr. Wright had submitted to Officer Potter's partner's arrest in the first place, you and I would not be having this conversation. Daunte Wright had a warrant out for his arrest for a crime he had committed. He has committed other violent crime against women. So when that officer said, you're under arrest, had he submitted to the lawful arrest, we would not be having this conversation. And this is happening too often. And I think one of the big problems is, and we're seeing it right now, is in the media and in communities in general, young people, especially young people of color, are being told, you don't have to cooperate with the police. Or they're being told, don't cooperate with the police because they are going to kill you. And yet, in every case that we look at in these controversial in-custody deaths, these controversial police shootings, if the subject that gets hurt or killed had just submitted to the lawful commands of law enforcement, they would be alive and they would be able to work through the system and get their due process. That's the American justice system.
Yeah, that does seem to be a common theme. What is it like these days for an officer doing a traffic stop?
When we conduct a traffic stop for a law enforcement out there, this anti-police sentiment and these young drivers who are being told you don't have to cooperate with the police, it's even more dangerous than it has been in the past. Understand that when a police officer walks up to a vehicle, generally speaking, we can't see the people inside until we get right up onto the vehicle. So a lot of times we have no idea who we're pulling over. Everyone saw probably last week, or should have seen, the video that came out of the New Mexico State Patrol of their state trooper making a routine traffic stop, and the driver came right out, walked back to the back of his vehicle where the trooper was, and shot and killed him. And that's what happens to law enforcement officers sometimes during traffic stops. It's one of the most dangerous activities that we get involved in.
You know, this death and the death of George Floyd have sparked riots, not just in Minnesota and in Portland, Sacramento, different places. What do you think police should be doing right now in the streets of those cities?
American law enforcement in some communities has done a very good job of trying to communicate with protesters. I talked to police officers last year in the Chicago suburbs where they were working at Black Lives Matter protests in their communities, and protesters, peaceful protesters, came up to them and thanked them for their service and told them, we know this is a very difficult thing. Remember, every police officer in the United States, when we get hired, we raise our right hand and take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of our state. So law enforcement officers revere the First Amendment. And we want people to be able to speak and to be able to demonstrate and protest, even if it's against us. But they have to do it peacefully. So the peaceful protests, not a problem. But the riots and the looting that we are seeing throughout the country, law enforcement has to stop that in its tracks. And the way to do that is to arrest anyone who is doing anything violent, dangerous, but we need to go one step further. We have to have prosecution, and we have to have prosecutors who are willing to take these cases to court.
Where do you see all this going now? And especially, you know, there's going to be a ruling on the George Floyd case, you know, coming up. What do you see happening?
I see this heading down a very dangerous, destructive path. Quite honestly, I'll be honest, I'm running out of optimism for people in cities like Minneapolis and Hennepin County, the surrounding county, Chicago and Cook County, Illinois, Sacramento, Austin, Portland, Seattle. We're going to see riots. We're going to see the continued infiltration of Antifa into the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, we're already seeing that now in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and we're heading down a very dangerous path because we have the Daunte Wright shooting, we have the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial is wrapping up. We're heading into a crash course.
While I have you here, I'd like to ask you one more question. The January 6th riot at the Capitol, Ashley Babbitt was shot by a Capitol police officer, and it's been announced that they will not be laying any charges against that officer. What's your take on that?
Well, I think what we have to look at is the continued politicization of law enforcement in this country. So we have an unarmed white woman who was an unabashed conservative. You know, she's in the MAGA movement. She loved Donald Trump. She did a wrong thing by being part of that group that broke into the Capitol. But from what we know of the details, and again, we don't know a lot, you know, other than the video that we can see of a police officer in a suit, and he's a black police officer. We're told he's a police lieutenant. That hasn't even been confirmed. But you see him raise up his pistol and fire one round at her, killing her. She was not armed, and to my knowledge, no one there was armed. You also see another video taken by a citizen journalist where you see police officers, some of them in riot gear, that are kind of behind Ashley Babbitt, and some of them are walking down the stairs. They're kind of getting out of the way. And that is very confusing to me as a police officer as to what was happening there. So now we've got this double standard, and I find that very dangerous. I think that if the Justice Department has said that that officer should not be charged, then that's fine. But I think that the American public deserves to know the details of why deadly force was deployed, because there's very strict rules when we use deadly force. And I think we also deserve to know that officer's name. There was really no reason to know the name of the officer that shot Daunte Wright, but yet it was released. And now she has had to flee her home. She's had to move out of her home with her husband, who did nothing wrong. Her family has no home now. And the demonstrators are coming to her home. They've had to surround it with fencing and barricades, and police officers have to sit there 24 hours a day just to try and keep the activists from burning down her home and burning down her neighborhood.
Yeah, that's one of the most remarkable things about this, how they have not released the officer's name. And it seems like in every single one of these cases, it's instantly released.
Yes, absolutely. And I understand the officer certainly has reservations about people finding out his name, but so does every police officer involved in a shooting. And I think what's most disturbing, or one of the most disturbing things, is the complete lack of curiosity by the legacy media. They don't seem to really care why Ashley Babbitt was killed. They don't seem to care. They're so concerned about police tactics and why we do what we do, until it comes to Ashley Babbitt, an unarmed woman shot and killed by law enforcement. And I think the American public deserves to know, and we need to have that discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
So as Sergeant Smith mentioned, Antifa and usually BLM are at the forefront of the violence. Our next guest has been tracking them very closely. So with us now, we have Andy Ngo, independent journalist from Portland, Oregon, who's been closely covering Antifa for years now. You even recently wrote a book detailing everything you've uncovered about Antifa called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. I want to ask you about one thing, or start with one thing in particular. There was an arrest of one Antifa member, a woman, for setting fire to the Portland Police Union Hall. And that arrest came after an informant told the police who set fire to it. That seems an unprecedented step. Is that the first time that's happened? And if so, what's the significance of that?
This is really significant because within 24 hours after this 19-year-old woman, Alma Raven Guido, was arrested, the arrest itself is not anything surprising. I mean, Portland has had ongoing riots now for more than 9 months. There's been 1,000 people arrested, and the district attorney's office always drops it. However, the prosecutor in this case, in this incident, within 24 hours, brought felony charges for arson and also reinstated some charges for felony rioting related to this suspect's alleged involvement in another Antifa riot that occurred in August of last year. And we see in the criminal complaint, as well as in the press release from the district attorney's office, that there was an informant who observed this suspect allegedly pouring chemical accelerant on the building and setting it on fire. And when she was arrested, she was found carrying lighter fluids and lighters. She had weapons on her. And so the response in the Portland Antifa community, if you will, they're panicking because this may possibly mean that somebody has infiltrated high until they're organizing, and there's a lot at risk because this is a criminal cartel. And if there's somebody in there and they don't know who it is who's informing on them, it could bring down the entire cell. I'm hopeful that that will happen, although I'm not sure if there's the political will for the investigators to actually go through and fully investigate all the links and ties that this individual suspect has. But this is at least a little bit of good news in regards to months and months of really terrible things happening in Portland with no changes happening.
So how are you monitoring the group? How do you know there's panic inside?
So a lot of the Antifa individuals in Portland, I've been monitoring their accounts for almost a year now. And a lot of them, before they put their accounts on lockdown, they were trying to accuse one another, saying, who was it? Who was the one snitching? And they're really scared. So they're locking down their social media accounts so that you can't see what they're saying anymore. I think that the group of people who are organizing, carrying out the violence is relatively small. So they stand a lot to lose, actually, if there's going to be a high level of distrust within their ranks. And Portland police and even federal authorities have not been effective at clamping down on the violence in Portland, which is still ongoing to this day. But hopefully this Antifa's own paranoia can be their undoing, one can hope.
Wow. So it's been my impression, and you can tell me if this is the case or not, I feel like Antifa members are getting a lot more brazen about announcing, there's going to be violence ahead of time. There is, they're promising there's going to be violence in the streets of Chicago, even ahead of the body cam footage being released of Adam Toledo's shooting. Is this just my impression, or is it the case that they're getting a lot more brazen and, I guess, brave?
They are becoming more brazen in that it's only April right now. It's still cold in a lot of the northern states, and yet they're taking out and showing, carrying out acts of violence that we saw at the height of the riots in 2020, and they're doing that at the beginning of the arc this year. And part of the reason why that's happened is because we've had now weeks and months, actually, of various BLM groups and Antifa groups and agitators inciting violence, getting people riled up in anticipation of the Derek Chauvin trial. They had a death to exploit before the trial's conclusion in the recent homicide of Daunte Wright near Minneapolis. And that immediately was put through, essentially, it was like a machine. They had a story out within hours after he was shot dead. The story was that he was killed by police over an air freshener. That's not true. That he was this great father, aspiring young person who was murdered by racist white police. And so, and, you know, they're represented by the same race-baiting attorney, Benjamin Crump, who also represented the family of George Floyd and Michael Brown. So you have all the same actors essentially playing out the same script, just with a different person who died, so they can exploit. I'm really concerned about what will happen once the trial concludes for Derek Chauvin, because these extremists have announced that if they don't get what they want, which is a murder conviction and a very heavy sentence, that they're going to burn stuff down, burn down America. They're already promising that. And they definitely have the capability to do so. And of course, they're given the leeway to do so because of weak Democrat leadership, as well as a reckless media that actually pours fuel on the flames by giving into these propaganda talking points and narratives that are spewed by Antifa and BLM extremists.
Yeah, it is a real concern because from the legal analysts we've been talking to, a murder charge is by no means guaranteed in this case. Let me move to something else. It just came out that one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Khan-Cullors, has bought $3 million worth of property, an avowed Marxist. What do you think about that? Because there's increasing connection, right, between BLM and Antifa, of course.
Yeah, so the response from BLM and Ms. Cullors herself is to say that the pushback in the press and people on the right is because of racism and white supremacy. They actually said it was an act of white terror. That's actually to deflect from the issue here. The issue here is what we all plainly see is hypocrisy. Ms. Cullors herself identifies as a revolutionary Black Marxist. And while condemning and preaching about the evils of capitalism, we've seen that she's amassed so much wealth for herself off of this BLM organization and the jobs that she's been offered after becoming a public figure because of BLM. She's able to buy at least 4 known properties in the United States worth millions of dollars. And although I guess if you look in the history of communism in the 20th century, it's not surprised that those in positions of communists in positions of power at the top will amass a lot of wealth, whereas the rest of the people who they fall victim to this ideology have to suffer in poverty and misery. So I don't find that particularly surprising, but I think what this shows is that BLM is, in my view, not just a violent extremist radical ideology and movement, it's also a scam and a fraud.
So while I have you, I want to ask you about one more thing. You recently, I guess, had a victory. You got the Independent to print a correction on a story where there were multiple falsehoods about you. So you got them to publish a correction. How did that come about?
So last month they published a news report, not an opinion column, and in it made a number of false statements that were defamatory towards me. One, they said that I have associations with neo-Nazi organizations and that I celebrated and cheered on the Capitol Hill riot. Both are true, were patently false. And these type of falsehoods have been printed, similar falsehoods have been printed about me ever since I became a public figure in 2019. And at that time, in 2019, I didn't have the income needed to put together a robust legal response to these papers. And I took the road of what I thought was dignified silence. And I realized that actually those lies then are repeated so often that people think it's true, and it's meant to get you canceled and to make you be perceived as such a toxic figure that nobody will want to hire you, nobody will want to publish you, etc. It wasn't successful with me. Now that I am better off and haven't been canceled, I thought it's the time for me to push back. I can't let so-called reporters and editors publish these type of blatant lies about me. And what's distressing about this, beyond my whole personal experience with having to deal with this, is that essentially, if you are libeled in the press, if you don't have the money to get a legal team together to do all the correspondence with the newspaper's legal team, you're out of luck. And I think it makes me angry that so many people, good, decent people, have been smeared and lied about in the press, and because they don't have the wealth to do so, they're not able to push back at all, and they have to have their reputations ruined. The role of the media, I think, one of the most important roles is to punch down. But what they do, because they're part of the establishment, is they punch down on people who they find threatening to their narrative. And certainly somebody like me, who challenges the reporting in the mainstream press about Antifa and BLM, is somebody they want to destroy.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Andy. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, the Supreme Court is officially under review. Which way will it go? Find out what our experts think. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask, should governors have unlimited powers over pandemic-related issues?
No, it should be temporary, only during the pandemic.
I think that the individual states should have a vote on whatever issues they may be for the states, and the federal government doesn't need to be involved.
There definitely should be control. Not, I guess, telling us what to do, but guiding us to the right direction.
I think he should be able to, because that's what it was set up for. The president was supposed to just oversee the whole thing. The governor is for the state and how he should run his state.
I don't think that unlimited power is for any leader.
Here in Florida, I feel like, they're doing a great job just allowing businesses to make their own individual decisions. I can't say that, I certainly know all the answers. I'm not sure even state elected officials really know all the answers. They're just doing the best they can to make everything as normal and as safe as possible.
That's complex. I really if I picture a pandemic dropping, and he has unlimited resources to get it contained. Egotistically, if I were him, yeah.
I don't know that it should be unlimited, but I am very much for the power of the state. I feel that federal power should be checked.
That's a tough one. Unlimited, I'm not so sure, but I think they should have a large breadth of what they can do, especially when it comes to the benefit of their community and their state.
I wouldn't say unlimited power, no. I think that it should go through, a voting process.
I think that any governor should also rely on their legislators.
I don't understand why it can't go through the democratic process.
Absolutely not. I don't believe that we know enough about what is going on for one person to be having unlimited reign on decision making.
No, I don't think they should have unlimited power.
No, I don't, because I think that there should always be checks and balance.
Yes, judging that when there's usually multiple people involved, it's like herding cats and you can never get one answer that's just needed right away based on what's going on.
I think any policy debate should be happening before any decision is made.
I think that's a good question because the people put him in power to make those decisions.
On the campaign trail, expanding or packing the Supreme Court became a hot topic. Candidate Joe Biden refused to say whether he was in favor of it or not, but he promised to study the matter. And to that end, on April 9th, he established a bipartisan commission to hold public meetings, evaluate reform proposals, and deliver a report in 6 months. So how much teeth does this commission have? Our next two guests weigh in. We have with us Adam Carrington. He's the Associate Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship. Adam, welcome. I guess the big question is, what do you make of the commission? Do you think it's appeasing the progressive, side of the party and really it'll come to nothing? Or do you think there's a real concern that, it might come back with recommendations that alter the Supreme Court?
That's the million-dollar question right now. And I think that the signs so far point to this being actually a detoxing of the situation of trying to reform or pack the court, as it's been called. And I say that because typically when presidents are really wanting to push something, they'll go ahead and put forward legislation. Or if they do set up something like a commission, they'll often give it the power to give at least recommendations. And this commission isn't even going to be able to do that. And I think that because of that, often presidents will establish commissions as a way of sort of placating where they don't really want to put forward real political capital. And just this last week, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi added to that, saying that she didn't want to bring a bill to the floor talking about expanding 4 more members to the Supreme Court. I think if you combine that with the fact that this was a commission and not a legislative proposal, it doesn't seem like Biden or others are really wanting to put a lot of force behind it. It does show that they're still getting a lot of pressure from the left to do something on court packing, but this is definitely not the most strenuous effort that he could have made.
And what do you think of the actual composition of the commission?
Yeah, there are 36 people on it. I don't know how that many people talk to each other and get a coherent document, but
particularly
that's a separate
during
issue. Exactly. Lots of Zoom meetings, I'm sure. But there are some good people on there that I think will be very fair. Jack Goldsmith from Harvard, Keith Whittington from Princeton, and Adam White from George Mason are all people who lean at least a little bit to the right, at least on issues like this, and I think are fair people. But overwhelmingly, it's going to be people who are of the left. And now even some of them, I think, are reasonably fair. Bob Barr, one of the co-chairs, has come out against court packing, I believe, in the past. That all said, I think that this is certainly stacked toward those who, at least in how they describe what's going on, are more likely to placate at least the left in saying that this could be a good move, that this could be something that should be pursued. Again, they're not going to make recommendations, but I would be surprised if the overall findings go that far afield of what a lot on the left are really pushing for right now, which is court packing. I'm just not sure that the president will do much about it when he gets it.
And there's a couple other, there's 4 things that the commission was charged with looking at, and one of them is term limits, one of them is the composition or number, but there's 2 others. I'm wondering if you can help explain what they might mean. The court's role in the constitutional system, and the second one is the court's case selection rules and practices.
The first one's pretty vague, at least in general. To ask what its role in the system would be more saying, does the court, the way it operates, act in too active or restrained a way? Does it, in certain instances, do more than it should be? And they probably have cases they don't like Citizens United or other cases like that in mind. So there's really not a whole lot concrete I could see coming out of that prong, more just analysis of giving the court a thumbs up or down. The only way I think that you could see as far as its case selection and rules, Congress does have the power to alter the jurisdiction of the court. And the jurisdiction is, before a court can decide who should win a case, it has to decide that it has the power to hear the case in the first place. And so I think one thing they might be asking is, are there alterations in the court's jurisdiction that one could do to try to make that happen? I don't even see that going very far. I again don't see there being much political muscle. I think the big question to ask right now is, what would Joe Manchin do? And he hasn't shown much stomach for this. In addition to the fact I haven't seen much out of the president or the current Speaker of the House.
So the Joe Manchin question is interesting because he has expressed that he's against court packing, but we also know there's pretty strong party discipline in Democrat ranks. So do you think he would be the sole person to come out against it?
I think the people to look at are those who voted against the $15 minimum wage when it came up recently. And there were 5, but I think the other one that I would most look at is Kristen Sinema out of Arizona. She's shown a bit of a independent streak, including that $15 minimum wage vote. So I think there are still some in the Senate who are, despite the party discipline, which I think you're right, are pretty worried about winning elections in states that don't have large liberal populations. This isn't, AOC's district, right? And so I think that, of course, circumstances could change where the pressures from the left really overwhelm their ability to resist. I'm not saying that's not that's not possible, but at least for now on this and things like the filibuster, despite already getting a lot of pressure, they haven't shown any signs of budging on these issues. We'll have to see going forward, but not so far.
And a lot of the attention has been on the court packing, but of course the other thing that's potentially on the table is term limits. Would that take a constitutional amendment, in your opinion?
That's absolutely, and that's a difference because the number of people on the court is actually set by Congress. The Constitution doesn't determine it. It's been different numbers at different times in American history, although 9 has been the longest by far. And I think how long it's been shows that at least Americans are very comfortable with it and would not be very open to changing it. But as far as term limits, that's set by the Constitution. It says in Article 3 that the Supreme Court justices, as well as all federal judges, shall hold their offices during good behavior. So the only way to really remove them, besides them resigning or them passing away, is impeachment. And there are reasons for that. And to undo that would require a constitutional amendment. So that may be recommended, but we've only amended the Constitution 27 times in our entire history. So again, something that I don't see getting to 2/3, the 2/3 that would be required in the House and Senate to even start that process.
So though it would seem to me that that one might be a little less controversial, of course, it would depend how it went into effect, if it would work, with the sitting justices or not. So do you think there's any appetite among Republicans for that sort of reform?
I think in this environment of partisanship, no, although I think in the past, of course, Republicans and conservatives have been very frustrated with the court and wishing that some of its older members were gone. And so I think that you would have to have a situation where there was bipartisan dissatisfaction with the court of the level that they believe that it's the older members who maybe aren't doing their job or aren't able to do their job. And I just don't see that at this point. It seems that the fact that the reason Democrats are doing this can't be separated. The reason that they're frustrated now and not in the past is that President Trump put on 3 of his own nominees. Democrats were angry about that. They were angry about the situation or circumstances under which those decisions were made. And I don't think Republicans are going to take this as a good faith effort, because it doesn't look like a good faith effort. And so even if they have their own issues about whether we shouldn't let 80 or 90-year-olds on the court, and there's some question of that's legitimate, I don't think given the circumstances they're going to give the Democrats the benefit of the doubt given why they're doing this.
All right, so bottom line, you're not too concerned about the outcome of this commission?
I'm not, and until circumstances change, it really does look like something that Joe Biden punted on during the campaign and that he continues to do. And I also think with the narrow majorities that the Democrats have, that they just don't have the political capital to do it. I think it would be a bad idea if they did, but until it becomes more realistic, I think this is a lot more sound and fury signifying nothing except sort of posturing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, that's just one analysis. Our next guest is also worried about altering the Supreme Court, and he has a slightly different view on the issue. Our next guest is Tom Fitton, president of Judicial Watch. Tom, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
So what do you make of the commission that President Biden appointed to look at reforming the Supreme Court?
I think the president is playing with dynamite. It's in one way an effort to kind of stall the extremists in his party that want to blow up our constitutional system by getting into proposing a process that would add members to the Supreme Court just based on political will alone. It would turn us into Chavez's Venezuela, I think, mighty quickly. On the other hand, he is encouraging the progressives by engaging and allowing their argument to be seriously considered. So the commission, on the one hand, wants to kick the can down the road while encouraging and inciting, to use the word of the day, the radical left to keep on pushing for the destruction of our constitutional system.
So you think his intention is to forestall things, but it may backfire on him? Is that what you think?
I mean, who knows? You know, you're kind of reading it. We're all reading this a little bit from the outside. I think some establishment Democrats don't want to destroy our Constitution. But there's this rising extremist wing in the party that is revolutionary, and their target is the Supreme Court of the United States. And this would be a coup against the court if they went through with, for instance, the legislation introduced this week would add 4 justices to the Supreme Court. It's so radical. It just is jaw dropping.
So what do you think would actually happen if they succeed in getting this through?
They will destroy the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And if Republicans take over, and that's an if, because their plan is to make it difficult for Republicans ever to take over again, you can bet Republicans will add more justices to the Supreme Court. So at the end of the day, we could have a Supreme Court as big as Congress. And obviously, that's the end of any independent judiciary.
Do you think there's any reasonable recommendations they could come back with, or any reforms that you think would actually be beneficial?
I doubt there'll be any reforms, any conservative, anyone concerned about the rule of law approach to constitutional issues could get behind.
So just before the commission was announced, Justice Stephen Breyer, who was a President Clinton appointee, was speaking at Harvard Law School, and he spoke out against expanding the court, saying that it would undermine public trust if the public sees judges as politicians in robes. Do you think right now the public sees Supreme Court justices that way?
Well, you know, Judge Bork, who never made it onto the Supreme Court, a conservative jurist, he talked about the tempting of America, meaning the temptation that judges have to act as politicians and not to apply the law as Americans expect them. And when they cave into that temptation, when they act political, it undermines confidence in the judiciary and it undermines confidence in the court. I think, for instance, the court's failure to grapple with the election controversies were political and undermined confidence in the courts. And that's one way to think about also this effort, this noise about packing the court. It's also a shot across the bow of the conservatives on the court to kind of scare them from doing what they might otherwise do in terms of judicial decision making.
And what do you think about term limits? Because that's something else that's been talked about, which presumably would require a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, all this would require a constitutional amendment, and there's obviously no grassroots effort to change the judiciary in such ways. Conservatives have been concerned about a judiciary that's moved beyond its traditional powers under the Constitution. But as I said earlier, that's not going to be under discussion. Term limits, obviously, if that had to be changed, that would have to be under the Constitution because at least the federal courts, they generally serve for life. So, the big question is, how is it the court fits in our constitutional system? Is it supreme, or is it one of three co-equal branches of government that has separate powers and doesn't encroach upon the other branches? That's the debate that we ought to be having, but it's not one the left wants to have. They see the court as territory to be conquered in their political remaking and revolutionary remaking of America.
All right, so we have to wrap up, but bottom line, this commission's going to come back in 6 months with a report. What are you expecting?
Oh, I think both sides will be unhappy. I think it will try to thread the needle, but I think it's a dangerous game that President Biden has been playing, and whatever happens, it's going to provide encouragement and a window of opportunity, as I say, for the extremists to undo our Supreme Court and our constitutional structure.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Coming up, after 20 years in Afghanistan, the troops are coming home. So what comes next? But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask how much Americans value our elderly.
I think that definitely the elder people have a very important role in society to be like grandparents and to be role models and stuff. I do think they're undervalued.
I would say generally, no. Many times they're ignored through policymaking and through even just being able to get wisdom from an older generation and their past history.
I believe their value isn't embraced, that they raised family and some of them went to war. Lifetime of knowledge, I mean, it's robust and we just don't, I think as Americans, first of all, we don't embrace that.
One of the things with me that I've always been this way is the young people and the elderly both. They're kind of the helpless. They can't do things to help themselves. What we see a lot in our profession is people taking advantage of elderly people that have money, trying to scam them. You hate to see people that can't help themselves being victimized.
It breaks my heart that I think there is a lack of appreciation.
I truly value them, but as a whole, I think sometimes they're put off on the side and left to themselves.
I don't know, I always think like young people don't like old people. I always think if you're going through a tough time, you should always kind of go to an elderly person because they usually have the answers.
I would say not nearly as much as they should be, or perhaps as much as they have been in the past, even my own life.
Personally speaking, yes. I have a great regard for elderly because I think they are the pillar of society. And without our elders, then we will be lost of who we are or where we come from.
Maybe not as much as they should be, but I feel like some people try to give them value.
I'm going to say yes because I have faith, but sometimes I don't think we care enough about our elders.
Traditionally, we listen to the young people. They're noisier, they're louder, they're of course more active, and we kind of ignored the older generation. It's sort of out of popularity, but I think we need to respect the elderly much more so. We need to take care of them better and listen to them more carefully because they do have wisdom.
This week, President Biden announced that the U.S. military will end its 20-year presence in Afghanistan, known as the Forever War. President Trump had also pledged to bring the troops home this spring, but there are wildly divergent views on the wisdom and risks of the move. And those divisions exist even inside parties and among veterans themselves. Joining us now is Jessie Jane Duff. She served 20 years active duty with the U.S. Marine Corps, retiring with the rank of gunnery sergeant. So I'd like to just right off the bat ask you what you think of President Biden's announcement of withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan.
Well, I'm grateful that he is following through on what President Trump had actually put in place. However, he has postponed it out to September, but I am fine with that. And I know there's a lot of people that are reluctant for us to come out of Afghanistan. They feel that this is an imminent threat to the United States still, but there is no empirical data that I have seen that suggests that we are under threat of Afghanistan or another September 11th. So I appreciate coming on this show so that I can give a viewpoint that may be contradictory of those that have been hardcore, staunch supporters of staying in Afghanistan.
Right, so Representative Michael Waltz, he gave an interview on Fox and Friends the other day.
This is Obama and Iraq all over again, right, where he just yanked everyone out. ISIS came roaring back. We had attacks all over Europe. The United, I think, is a boneheaded idea. But more broadly, Brian, you know, this is Obama and Iraq all over again, right, where he just yanked everyone out. ISIS came roaring back. We had attacks all over Europe, the United States. They had a caliphate the size of Indiana. American citizens in orange jumpsuits getting beheaded. The intelligence community is clear that that is what it will happen with al-Qaeda and possibly ISIS too in Afghanistan. But here's the difference, and here's why this is so much worse. You have a lot of bases in the Middle East around Iraq that we could launch back in from. In Afghanistan, this is a pathway to another 9/11. They will launch attacks back into the United States. The intelligence community is clear.
You know, I find it very insulting to the American people to think that we have spent close to probably how many billions, if not trillions of dollars now in defending this nation against terrorism. We created an entirely new branch of government, which was the Department of Homeland Security, for example. We now have terrorism watch lists that you can't board planes. We've also ensured that we don't have people coming to our country, although Joe Biden has lifted a lot of that, where you cannot verify their actual credentials. So I would like to know that this is an imminent threat, another 9/11, because I find that insulting to suggest that the 3,000 men in Afghanistan are going to prevent that from happening. There is no data that I have read. I try to stay up on national security issues. And if that is the case, I think the American people should be made very well aware of it. Other than that, you know what they're doing? They're using the George Bush talking points from that era. Hey, I was under President Bush. I appreciated him as commander-in-chief, but there was no intention on the day that we went into Afghanistan for us to be there 20 years later. We are now there 12 years longer than we even were in Vietnam. And at this point, the American people need to know, what is your tangible results at this point? If it's just to keep our presence there, that is not good enough.
So do you think there is any risk of Afghanistan backsliding and being a safe haven for terrorists, and that posing a threat to American soil, American troops?
Well, there's always going to be that risk, but does it justify having us spend millions and billions of dollars on the level that we have continually done for the last 20 years? At some point, you have to say, now, how do we manage it? You have to do risk assessment, risk management. And I appreciate the congressman coming forward and advocating for us to stay there. And he had actually served over there, which I even greatly more. He was a ranger. He had done his tours over there. But he's repeating and regurgitating talking points that I find insulting now. You go in and you accomplish your mission, which we really have done. We have suppressed the imminent threat that was upon our country. We have retaliated against al-Qaeda. Heck, we've even ensured that Osama bin Laden was killed. So at what point are we still to stay there and have our lives at risk? I would dare to say we have enough intelligence operations and capabilities out there to ensure that if there is any rise, that we can react to it. But the congressman's position was we need to stay there and keep a pulse on things and have oversight of things. That's not what your military should be doing. You have human intelligence capabilities throughout this country. For example, the CIA operations. We've had over 24,000 Americans killed or wounded in Afghanistan. Many of them have been contractors and obviously U.S. military presence. Under 2,000 contractors have been killed, and roughly close to 3,000 military men and women have been killed in Afghanistan. These are very high numbers. Now, there also is the argument we haven't had a death toll in the past year, but to minimize any death, just suggesting we've had 1 year without a death toll, that's a great success. That would tell me that we probably have seen a grave accomplishment over there. But you're not going to restructure the Taliban. You're not going to restructure the Afghanistan government. The Afghanistan government at some point has to be accountable for their own security and safety. Why is it after 20 years, I hear the congressman still pitching that we need to ensure they are trained? I served 20 years on active duty. It didn't take 20 years to train me. So I would just dare to say we're rehashing the same old talking points, that we want to keep the war over there. We don't want it coming home. They're suggesting that we can't keep a pulse on Iran if we pull out. They're suggesting we need to have a backdoor operation into China. All of these arguments have no tangible plan behind them, and they're not necessarily even legitimate because we're not doing that. I dare to say that President Trump was right. You don't want to be in endless wars. And how can the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff say we still need to spend more time over there? 2 decades is long enough.
Let me ask you this. What do you think about the optics of setting 9/11 as the date for withdrawal?
Yeah, the representative, Congressman Waltz, was upset with that. He felt it was insulting. Look, I am not, for full disclosure, I am not a big fan of President Biden. I was the co-chair for Veterans for Trump. I was a strong advocate for President Trump's policies. I don't think that that is an argument that I'm going to be upset over or offended by. I have bigger issues than the date of withdrawal. There is a symbolism of September 11th because that's when we were attacked. And I think the symbolism is not insulting. It essentially, to me, means we are peacefully leaving. And those are the arrangements that we have made with Afghanistan. And we have talked with the Taliban to ensure that there are no attacks upon U.S. forces as they are withdrawing. I don't think it's a celebration for the Taliban. But if we are going to hang on to our pride, that is a very, very expensive commodity of blood and treasure, and that does not legitimize staying. Just like with Vietnam, we saw that entire region fall to communism. If that region does not ensure that they protect themselves from terrorism, then we don't have any influence, because the Taliban is a cultural and tribal difference between an organized government of that of Afghanistan. You are talking about an entire mindset versus that of a government. So us being there to bring stability is wonderful, but as long as we are in a combatant operation and the potential loss of life is as great as it is, I dare to say most Americans have grown war weary. And I can appreciate that President Biden has said it's been this way under how many administrations. He doesn't want to pass it on to the next.
So we're going to have to wrap up, but let me ask you just one more thing. I want to go back to what you said about negotiating with the Taliban, that's part of the withdrawal discussion. How much can we trust the Taliban?
You can't trust the Taliban, but at what point do you have to look out for trusting your forces and trusting the American people that overwhelmingly have war fatigue, that have been tired of seeing those come home, that have been wounded, and those who have been killed? Yes, granted, this past year we haven't had a death toll, but it doesn't mean that it could not happen. So at this point, meaning that since the Taliban did not make any death toll apparent in the past year, I think that they are welcoming our departure, of course. And yes, it's possible they will uprise again, but I can't go off of speculation. When you're speculating without any concrete data, without any formidable intelligence, and I will say, at this point, I feel this is the right move. And if we have to re-engage, we still have bases that have been built by the American forces. And I trust that we have built a relationship with Afghanistan, that they would welcome our assistance if there is that problem. If Kabul is going to fall to the Taliban, I am confident that in 20 years, we have trained the Afghanistan military to be competent enough to defend themselves. And if we haven't in those 20 years, then we should be ashamed of our efforts.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks, and join us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
We have a new channel. Subscribe to us on YouTube at NTD News. Get the highlights of our news broadcast and the most important headlines that we curate especially for you.
Don't miss out on important news. Our videos are being deleted. So if you don't want to be cut off from honest news, take a moment to sign up for our newsletter at newsletter.ntd.com so you don't lose access to NTD. Go to newsletter.ntd.com to sign up for our evening newsletter.